Well, to take a look and try and understand what's happening in our country with the rise in COVID numbers, I'm now joined by Dr. Gagandeep Kang. Thank you very much, Dr. Kang, for being with us. The question that keeps being asked now increasingly is that why haven't we opened up vaccinations to all adults? Is this a shortage issue, a delivery issue, or is it a policy issue at this juncture?
I think it's all of the above. You need to balance the size of India's population, all of whom need to be vaccinated at some stage, with the supply that is available from the vaccine companies that we have in the country, and the policy that has been laid down that has established who the priority populations are and how the vaccination program should proceed. One of the things that we could be thinking about is what are the conditions where modifications might be appropriate. So if you have locations where you're seeing surges in cases, is that the kind of place where you would like to modify your vaccination program? It certainly is something that policymakers need to be thinking about.
Dr. Kang, what about, even if it's not all adults who are vaccinated imminently in the next phase, what about having, say, 45 plus individuals without comorbidities, taking into account that, supply will need to be built up as well? Could that be a next step?
It could be. The government had already laid down a priority list that originally had people over 50, and that was modified to be people over 60. So there's no real problem in terms of adjusting the age barrier. And it really does make sense to go by ages rather than have this 45 plus comorbidities and a restrictive list of comorbidities requiring certification, which makes it more difficult for people to get vaccinated.
Yeah. Doctor, the bottom line is, people don't seem to care enough at this stage, and we've known that this was going to happen. It was just a matter of time. Do you believe that there are various failings at the level of state governments in not having enforced social distancing or what have you? This was always going to happen.
I think this is a collective responsibility, and the sooner we recognize that, the better. The onus is on us to behave as citizens. The onus is on the government to give us direction on what needs to be done. We are all partners in this. What do we want? We want for people to not get sick and not die. And the only way we are going to do that is by everybody working together.
We have the big Kumbh Mela now taking place in Uttarakhand. Tens of thousands of people assembled in one area, no masks presumably would be there. It just seems like a potential super spreader event. And yet, as we have conversations like this, there seems to be a complete mismatch between what we're trying to talk about here and the reality on the ground, where, people just don't care about the fact that you've got massive Kumbh Melas taking place. People can fall very sick.
Sometimes you get lucky and you have gatherings of people, and super spreader events don't happen. And that we've seen before. We got lucky with Diwali last year, locations, not in all of them. So I think it's not guaranteed that where you have gatherings of people that you will have a rapid increase in cases, but it does increase the likelihood. And I think the one thing we need to focus on is on communication and on education, and then be prepared if that is insufficient. The advantage we have is that a large proportion of the population has already been infected and hopefully has some level of protection. And the second fact is that most of these gatherings are taking place in the open. So where there is more air circulation, and that generally leads to lower levels of transmission than in indoor settings. That's not the answer, but I think it will be some level of mitigation.
So essentially we are hoping against hope at this stage. I don't think there's anything better for us to do. Today the government has come out with numbers of the South African variant, the UK variant, and the Brazil variant. In India, that number has gone up to 400. That's what, doubled approximately, right, since the last time we had these numbers?
It's still tiny. It's remember that the 400 is based on strains that have been sequenced, and the sequencing itself is relatively limited. So what we need to be doing is sequencing a lot more strains. We should be thinking about potentially developing diagnostic tests that are easier than sequencing so that we can use PCR-based approaches to identify the variant strains more easily. It's also important to remember that the variant strains that we import are not the only variants in the world. It is very feasible that we have variants of our own that we have not yet identified because we haven't put the sequencing and the epidemiological data together. And we really should be doing that. It's urgent, it's important.
How long does it take to sequence a particular variant of this virus? How much time does it take?
You can get sequencing results back in a day. But because sequencing is expensive, what you want to do is try and do batch sequencing, so have hundreds of samples and then sequence them all together. And that results in your waiting until you have sufficient to do a sequencing run. You could do single samples, but it's not very efficient. And lately, supply of reagents has also been a problem, because many of these reagents that are required for sequencing are imported reagents.
Dr. Kang, one final question. Are you sufficiently satisfied with the science thus far on the impact of a single dose of the vaccine, whether it's Covishield or Covaxin? I know that it's a 2-dose regimen. The reason I'm asking is the numbers are going up. If we are to step up vaccination, would there be some sort of guarantee that people who get even 1 dose would be protected?
It's a question of the level of protection. We give 2 doses because we think we will get more complete protection after 2 doses. It does not mean that if you get a single dose of vaccine, you have no protection whatsoever. In the case of the Covishield vaccine, there is some evidence to show that prolonging the 2nd dose does not result in, there is some level of efficacy, about 70% efficacy with the single dose. And the 2nd dose gives you an increased immune response, and the longer you stretch the interval, the greater the efficacy you have. Such data are not available for Covaxin. So where a vaccine has been tested at a 4-week interval and it has no data to show that a gap really matters, I would suggest we stay with the 4-week gap. So for Covaxin, absolutely a 4-week gap. For AstraZeneca, the Covishield vaccine, we have some data that seems to indicate that we will not be putting ourselves in an unsafe position by giving a single dose as long as the 2nd dose is taken by 12 weeks.
I had one final question to ask you. Till a couple of weeks back, you know, we were actually seeming to win this fight, but of late the numbers have obviously gone up. I ask about the Covaxin efficacy data. The initial data suggests that it's 80% effective, but obviously for it to be statistically relevant, you need to have approximately 130 cases which are positive. It's my sense that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that to get that number up to 130 from what, 40, 45 that they have so far, would need a much larger number of tests being carried out in the trial process. Is that, given the fact that still overall in most states the numbers in India are still low, is it a battle against time? I mean, could it conceivably take many more months before you get that number?
No. So if we look at the design of the trial that Bharat Biotech had for Covaxin, it has 25,800 participants. It finished the recruitment of those 25,800 participants, half of whom got the vaccine, by the middle of January. We were able to get 43 cases by the end of February. And remember that you begin to count cases only 2 weeks after the 2nd dose of vaccine, which means for the last person who was recruited into the study, you could have begun to count cases only on the 1st of March. Nice. Now, if you look at the early recruits, they are the ones that have contributed the 43 cases already. And given that the 43 cases accumulated when we were in the trough of cases, I think we won't have to wait too much longer for the 130 cases to be accumulated. Sometime latest, I'm guessing, end of April, maybe well before that.
So essentially, it's that 25,000 trial cases that we have so far, that alone will generate, you believe, that 130 number. You won't need anything further than that.
I think we will be fine.
You should be fine with that. That's interesting to know. Thank you very much, Dr. Kang. Wonderful to speak to you as always. We'll need to take a short break at this stage. There's a lot more coming up.